Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. We're excited that you've joined us. Our topic is a really interesting one, how to permanently fix the most common DevOps security blunders. Boy, take on a big challenge. There's a challenge there. I think we had a little bit of fun with that webinar title. My name is Mitch Ashley, and I'm going to serve as your host and also as one of the speakers today. And we're very happy to be having Beyond Trust sponsoring today's webinars. Just a few housekeeping items. First of all, we are recording the webinar, and we will send a link to everyone via email to both the webinar as well as download the slides so everyone can get access to that. We're also giving away 3 gift cards at the end of the webinar, so please hang around, find out who our 3 winners are. Now, our other speaker and myself love questions. So we hope you'll pop some questions into the questions tab on the GoToWebinar software, and we'll be addressing those closer to the end of the webinar. So let's move on to our topic, how to permanently fix the most common DevOps security blunders. It's my pleasure to introduce one of our speakers today is Jason Jones. Jason is Senior Product Manager at Beyond Trust. And of course, myself, I will be talking a little bit more about who I am during my part of the talk. So let's go ahead and move forward to our talk on most common security blunders, how we solve those common security problems on DevOps and software development. Just a little bit of background about myself. So you know kind of where I'm coming from as we talk about this topic. Been very fortunate being both on the vendor and also the user, if you will, consumer side of IT technologies through my career, both as a vendor technologist and executive, and also an IT leader, and started out as a developer. So I've kind of worn both hats and had to even buy products in the categories that I used to make. Worked both for large enterprises and also repeat entrepreneur with some startup companies, product companies, and tend to be an early adopter. I started in security in '98, got into cloud, got into DevOps reasonably early on. And today I run an organization that provides services around DevOps, around cloud, around creating software and how we adopt some of these new technologies. And I work with both DevOps.com and I lead an organization called Accelerated Technologies Group. So let's move forward on our topic. We are experiencing huge transformations, both in our industry, but also in our own professions. It's interesting, kind of all the changes that are happening. And I just want to touch on this first to set some context as we talk about security, because it's an opportunity now to do some things a little bit differently. But what's driving these changes is not just technology, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but also the transformation that's happening on the business side. You hear terms like, often used digital transformation, gets used in a lot of ways, but one of the fundamental meanings of digital transformation is because of the enablement of the new technologies that we have and ways that we use it, business now are looking to IT, they're looking to software teams, product teams to be able to create technology, applications, products, et cetera, much more rapidly to the point where they can exercise and go after disruptive business models, either to gain traction in markets they're in, new markets, or fend off threats in their own markets. And that's what's behind this whole kind of business model disruption of digital transformation. So the expectation is that we as software creators can deliver that software much more quickly with reliability and of course security. And of course, one of the fundamental things behind that is DevOps. And I'm a big believer in DevOps, not just because it's the one best of all methodologies or whatever, but because DevOps is a lot more than just a software development methodology. It's really about changing how the organization works, how it works together. The dev team, the test team, security team, operations team, auditing, product, even the executives, their engagement with how we create software. It's really brought us together and dropped some of those silos, those barriers, and got us into a much more collaborative model as opposed to the traditional command and control siloed kind of organizations. But it also means we're doing things differently in how we create software. CI/CD, continuous integration, continued deployment is a fundamental different way of thinking about how we deliver software, something that used to take months, sometimes years to create releases. We're doing in minutes, maybe tens of minutes, multiple times an hour. Different environment, but it's all because we're doing a lot more automation. through how we create software. So think about security in that context. Just like we don't do the same things manually in software creation or distribution testing, there's things we can do differently in how we touch on security, and I'll address them in a moment. Next slide, if you would. Also, the technologies that we're using, of course, are different. Now, we certainly have a lot of existing legacy applications, but even those are being lifted and shifted into the cloud. Some of them are. Some are being re-architected or portions. But we're creating much more cloud-centric or cloud-friendly as well as mobile apps. We're using services in the cloud as opposed to tools and products that we used to solely just bought and used within our own environments. Many teams are using open source not just as an adjunct, but as a strategy. Matter of fact, many developers really just want to work with product companies who have embraced open source. Maybe they have an open core kind of strategy where they provide an open source version of their product, or the product is open source and they add other things to it as part of the commercial service. Of course, we're architecting applications differently. Because we want to move faster, one of the reasons, we're breaking things down into much smaller components, putting them in containers, creating microservices. We're building applications that much more rely on not APIs just as an integration point for external third parties, applications, companies, et cetera, but we're also building applications so the APIs are how the application talk to itself, which creates a whole nother layer of security concerns. And also the infrastructure, just as it's moved to the cloud, parts of the infrastructure, maybe all the infrastructure is becoming code. And we use tools like Terraform to be able to create our infrastructure dynamically rather than being something static that we set up and configure either in software or hardware. Of course, serverless is one of the approaches that an event-driven approach to applications that we're pursuing now for the right kinds of applications. But behind all this is kind of shifting from this monolith to micro or microservices approach. Now, kind of washing over all of this is, well, how are we doing security? And it's a broad topic, of course, security, and we don't have time to touch on all of it, but we're really focusing on kind of the privileged access management part of this, and that's what I'll be talking about. So let's move to the next slide. I like to analogize development teams as things we used to do in hardware. So some folks still do in hardware. Development teams, even when they're part of a larger organization, really have a way that they create software, so they have to create the environment, set up the tools, set up the practices, even if they're adopting something they've been doing. Certainly true when you're doing a greenfield type of application. And like a wiring closet, I remember when I used to do network work, so pretty quickly discovered that the wiring closet looked great the day that I closed the door when we finished setting it up. And I don't know how long it was, seemed like 5 minutes. You opened the door and all of a sudden it looked like the thing on the right. Well, that kind of happens in the software world too, where the processes, how we do security, the tools, who does them, how kind of seriously we take those, if you want to think of it that way. Those principles, or lack of them, are what get replicated and carry through into the product, into the software development, into the technology. Oftentimes we have to go back and unwind and undo some of those things. More often, probably, we don't go back and fix some of those things, which can lead to some of the security issues that we have. So my point being is that we're going to evolve how we work, how we operate. And the thing, as much as we can do up front to help us set ourselves up for success around security, the better. So let's go to the next slide, please. So let's talk about some of the most common mistakes. I certainly haven't listed them all, but I can tell you, I think most, if not all of these, I've certainly made myself and learned from them. And I'm not going to go into depth in every one of these because I think most of them have probably experienced some, if not all, and more. But one of the things I start with is we still work in an environment where secrets, IDs, and passwords are found left on a server somewhere in plain text. And they're stored in code, or they can be in multiple places. And so we don't encrypt information as important as just IDs and passwords. Excuse me. So let's make sure that we certainly encrypt and protect information that we need to secure. Also, we rely too heavily on shared secrets, passwords. It is convenience, and frankly, that's how most end users think of security: is whatever's most convenient, keep security out of the way, I'll do what I have to do. But we're really more interested in performing the function or job or using the software, the device that we want to use, and not thinking about security, at least not letting it get in the way. So we still rely too heavily on default passwords, etc. We also use a lot of shared accounts. It's very common on a development team that somebody has the AWS account, and so that's what we use to start developing under, and that's where the keys are created and managed, and poof, all of a sudden we've gone from 3 developers to a team of 20, 30, or 50, and we're going, look, this doesn't work anymore. We've got to create a different setup to do that. Secret sprawl, that meaning we're storing keys, tokens, credentials, certificates, not just in one place, but they're showing up in multiple places. And also, the next point, in multiple secret management systems, whether it be something that's provided as part of a cloud provider in Azure or AWS or Google or others, to our own corporate systems, to things that are kind of embedded in platforms, on our laptops. Suddenly we've got secrets everywhere. And if we aren't conscious about how we want to manage that, that easily gets out of control. And of course, somebody moves on and now nobody knows how to access it anymore. We also tend to like flexibility. We don't want security to get in the way, even if we're software creators, testers, etc. And so we'll tend to rely on excessively broad or too broad access permissions. And of course, role-based is a great way to go, but even with that, we can be too broad with those permissions. So thinking about that and how we want to set it up right up front is definitely worth doing. Something extremely important, and we'll get into this as we think about this in a DevOps context, is we need access control logging, traceability, auditability. As we automate these things, we have to have that. We need it anyway for triage, for diagnostics, for incident management, etc. But that's got to be a fundamental thing that we're holding as importance, and we're going to rely on not just up front, but down the road. Of course, in the environment we're in now, it's not uncommon to have the need to refresh things like keys, certificate, tokens, passwords, etc. On a much more frequent basis, not just when someone leaves the dev team and we need to refresh the passwords or the keys, but even in applications. We have applications that are talking to IoT devices that sometimes rely on a certificate that might have a life of minutes, maybe even seconds, because it's using the certificate only on a session base that doesn't last very long. So these things are moving quickly beyond a manual process that we could use to manage that, and something that we're going to have to be able to do programmatically. Of course, the dreaded policy word, right? We all love policy. I'm being facetious about that, of course, but we need them. I mean, what are policies? They're really agreements about how we're going to operate. Sometimes they're requirements the business might impose, or regulation might impose on us, but we can use that to our advantage. Just really think about it of how are we going to manage our security? How are we going to force it? And what are we going to do? What are the consequences when it isn't followed? And I'm not saying everybody that violates policy should get let go or something like that, but we want to do it, and we want to hold it as important and make sure that we follow through. So the last one to me is really the most important in all of them. I probably should have put it first, but it really affects everything I've talked about so far. There's this thought around if security is so important that everyone owns security, not just one person. My experience, not just with security, but with other things, but whenever we say everyone owns security, everyone owns whatever, it tends to be nobody owns it when we do that. And so we're all assuming somebody else will take care of it, or there's no kind of really thought about how all of us are going to implement it, and then working with the organization or with the team about how to follow through on that. So I think it's important to move beyond just it's so important that we all need to own it, and really think about consciously how we address security. Next slide. We're talking about privileged access management. I think that's one of the fundamental things that we start with. Again, there's a lot more to this. We think about application security, the production of all kinds of things. But one of the things for a development team, it certainly starts with what our software stack is that we're using, the technologies, what the tool chain, the technologies we're using as part of our development test, CI/CD environment, and of course, how are we going to manage the access and the privileges to all of that, not just people, but tools, processes, software, applications, automation, all of that. So by starting out thinking about how we're going to do privileged access management, certainly going to help set us up for a lot less pain down the road, and thinking about that now. So let's move on to the next slide, please. Now the span of that, and I'm not listed anything by any stretch, but it's certainly more than just IDs and passwords, secure communications, connections around TLS, SSH, SSL, tokens, certificates. As we sort of think now beyond that into the application layer, I mentioned microservices and service mesh. Applications are being constructed around APIs and services, which aren't going to be protected just by APIs that other people talk to, a few of those that are kind of the outer shell of the application. Oftentimes those APIs are being exposed in those services and the service mesh, not just within the application, but to other applications, to other organizations, to other companies, or as a service to end users and their devices. So we have to think about the security of the system, the applications, and all the way into the APIs and how we access and control, manage access to that. Of course, containers, microservices I talked about, data, of course, super important. Another place where it's very common or not unusual to have a database user provide their account is what we access to the database, and poof, all of a sudden all the applications are relying on that, and they leave, or they need to change some of their access or privileges or scope of how they use that account, and we're relying on that. Cloud services, of course, how we secure that in a private as well as hybrid multi-cloud environment. Dev test production, now that sounds simple, but usually it's multiple of those, right? And not just user identity, which tends to be thought of as PIM as a subset of PAM, but that identity of devices. This is a world that I come from in communications, where really millions of devices are out connected to networks, and being able to rely on knowing that those devices are who they say they are. If it says it's a thermostat on a wall, it really is. It's not someone pretending or some software pretending to be that, but also what the privileges are, what services they can use, et cetera. We need to know the identity of those devices that are connecting, whether it's an end user's mobile device, an IoT, or a system, across the cloud. Next slide, please. And we think about this in a tool chain context, and I've packaged this primarily around the dev process, the dev integration and testing. You can expand this tool chain into the operations side as well of DevOps, as well as security, as well as data. So there's other components to this, is what I'm trying to say. But when you think about it in the dev context, of course, we start with source management. I think we all are using some sort of source management service or function, whether it's GitHub or a tool locally within our development environment. But big question, a lot of folks store credentials in their source management system, which might be okay when you control access to that internally, but certainly you don't want that showing up in GitHub or some other external service. Now, GitHub actually has some tools available to help you find those things, but that's an easy place for those things to leak out, your IDs and passwords, even private keys. How we secure our dev tools and their access to information, the configuration management of the environment. I talked about kind of infrastructure as code. That would be another way to think of this. And of course, the containers, how we manage containers, there's tools around doing that today, how we deploy those. I mentioned the API approach, API economy to creating applications. And of course, our continuous integration, continuous deployment. Now, those are automated things now, not someone who's written a script to create that function to run that kicks it off. It's happening on a minute-by-minute basis, and it has access to very secure information, credentials, as well as code. It has access really to most everything. So we have to make sure we've set ourselves up for success for that automation to be able to function without manual intervention, but make sure we've given the appropriate privileges and I can manage key rotation, password rotation, et cetera, through that. So it's an important part of this topic, and you can delve down, and I'm going to talk about this in just a moment I think on the next slide about how we can take this, for example, into a CI/CD process. So next slide, please. Now, for privileged access management in this market, there's a number of ways, of course, we can do this, approaches, and we're going to be hearing about one approach with Beyond Trust in just a minute. Jason will be talking. But there are multiple approaches, and oftentimes you do use multiple kind of solutions or technologies. As I mentioned earlier, certainly open source is a favored approach, and there are a lot of good capabilities. Matter of fact, I mentioned being able to detect things like keys and passwords in GitHub. There's some tools to do that. Open source is a great approach. You do have to be aware that some open source projects are a little farther along in their maturity than others. I just did some podcasts with some folks working on Spinnaker, which came out of Google. And it's one of the things they're working on is their credentials management. It's still early. The capabilities in there are probably fair to say, not quite mature yet, but are getting there. So you do have to be aware about that. Of course, commercial solutions, we're talking about Beyond Trust today, and there are a number of folks in the PAM market who have various strengths in that approach. It can be delivered on an on-prem or a cloud solution, but also the cloud service providers themselves. So you think about what I was mentioning earlier, the proliferation of these environments of the management tools, AWS, Azure, Google, et cetera. And then there's also some of the technologies themselves that come with those capabilities, like an Ansible environment, a Chef, even OpenStack with Barbican, et cetera. So there are multiple approaches, and more than one may apply, but you certainly have many options to think through of how you want to both start and then evolve from. Great, let's move on to our next slide, please. So I'd like to provide some principles rather than just some individual fixes. And again, you'll notice the trend. My last one is the most important one that I want to talk about. But I do want to connect back to something I mentioned earlier. You have to establish true ownership for security. That doesn't mean one person does it. Doesn't mean one group does it. You may have a security team. They're going to be much happier when they see how security has been implemented across the development process, not just that some person is responsible for it, but really who's responsible for the strategy, the approach, the technology, how it's done in the team, how that's validated with organizations like the security department. So think about the environment that you're deploying into. How's this product or software going to be built? What's the environment it's going to be put in? Is it going into end users' hands? Is it on mobile devices? Is it showing up in someone else's data center in the cloud? Or a combination of all those things, plus your own environment. And think about how you can start yourself by building in security up front into your environment, as well as, of course, your application and the infrastructure. There's this idea around this repetitive convenience. Just take the easy approach. And I'm not necessarily saying spend all our time by implementing huge complex security architectures, but we have to shy away from the convenient approach. And if we need to solve an aspect of security of how we're going to do this for the CI/CD process, let's do that now. If you've read the Phoenix Project, you'll know the term Brent. That's the single point of failure, the person who kind of does everything, often the bottleneck. It's not one person's job to do security, but you need to make sure that you have the right responsibilities distributed across the team and across the organization. Now, to my most important point about this, in a DevOps context, we're talking about doing security on a continuous basis. We have to kind of stop thinking about security as something we set and forget. And that's because the processes are automated now. You can pick any part of it, whether it's infrastructure, the app, the monitoring, doing continuous validation. Those are things you're not going to do manually. You don't want to do, because you don't want to spend doing time on that, just like you don't spending time on doing builds anymore. That's done many times an hour. So you have to shift from security being kind of an afterthought to every point in the process. How are you going to not only do security, but most likely automate it? So that rather than approving a release with the security team, we're approving the process with the security team. They see where security is being built into CI/CD, into source control, into credentials management, all of that. And then we can monitor how it's working and audit the process rather than audit every time that it happens. So if you think about a CI/CD process of pulling code, pulling software, whether it's from an IDE or from a pull request in an automated process, going through continuous integration with libraries, looking for licensing, looking for not only failed tests, but also or you may have security vulnerabilities in code. Do you have your credentials protected? Pen testing the dev environment, make sure connections are secure, all the way to pushing that out into a production environment. Those are processes that we want to automate. So we want to automate the management and integrate the management of our credentials into that kind of a process. So that's just picking CI/CD. You could pick any part of this of infrastructure as code, the dev environment, etc. So start thinking about security as continuous security, not an instance or set and forget. And I think that will help set us all up for a much easier path to moving into a DevOps process, both within the security, within the development team, but also across the organization with security, with operations, etc. And let's go to our next slide. Just wanted to provide some contact information. You're welcome to follow me on LinkedIn, on Twitter. I highly recommend that you check out the DevOps Chat podcast. We talk about security, we talk about DevOps, we talk about cloud, many kind of interrelated topics to what we're talking about today. So thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to present to you. Jason, I'd like to hand it over to you next.
Great. Thanks everybody for joining today. As Mitch mentioned, my name is Jason Jones. I'm a product manager here at Beyond Trust. Quick apology about my voice. We had a cold snap and it's messing with my voice a little bit. So apologies, but we're going to push through. So real quick, since this is not necessarily a Beyond Trust audience, want to make sure we give an overview of Beyond Trust, the company, and what it is that we do. So essentially, we are a privileged access management company that has kind of a few different definitions, more commonly referred to as PAM. But the way that we break that down into different solution sets is into these kind of three primary pillars. The first of which is for privilege and password and session management. This is essentially managing those critical credentials in your environment, the accounts that give access to the admin level configuration within, the root accounts, the administrator accounts for Windows systems, anything that you consider critical. Being able to manage those accounts, not just in keeping them up to date and rotated, but also granting explicit access to the people who need access to those credentials, as well as monitoring the access and use of those credentials within the environment. The second pillar is about endpoint privilege management. So really this can be thought of as just removing too much privilege within the environment. So me as a desktop user, not having an admin account and being able to have more privilege within my environment, but still providing the right tools and capabilities to allow me to do the job that I need to do. There are some things I do need to be able to install and some actions I do need to be able to take as a user. And so making sure that we have the right granularity around privilege within an environment. And then the last of which is for secure remote access. Certainly granting somebody access to a credential is one level of access, but there's also environments where there's kind of separate, more secure networks that you need to actually facilitate connectivity to. And so we provide the tools that are necessary to not just be able to access the system itself, but actually foster the connectivity into those environments, including things like support desk situations where the user may not always be in a controlled environment, and you still need to be able to connect to it in somewhat of an administrative or privileged manner. So back on to kind of the topic at hand today around DevOps and securing the DevOps tool chains and pipelines. And it's kind of an interesting topic when we think about DevOps and security and how it applies to DevOps, and why are we kind of thinking about and talking about security as even almost a separate topic to DevOps or a related topic. And I think it's interesting to kind of think about why we need to do that separately, or why we are kind of including it in after the fact. Things like there's DevOps the term, and then there's separately DevSecOps the terms, or there's DevOps teams and then separately security teams. And so it's important to note that I don't think that DevOps is necessarily void of security or kind of anti to wanting to be secure. It's just not necessarily one of the goals of DevOps as a workflow or a practice or a team, right? It's all about agility and speed and quality. And security is almost thought of in some regards as an output of it. It's not necessarily one of the goals, but it's something that you might achieve if you have the right DevOps practices. You know, the consistency of deployment, the controlled automation, all really leads to a more secure environment, which is great. But what we want to do is to be more intentional about applying security to sorry, I missed that slide. Applying security to the entire process from start to finish. And as Mitch mentioned earlier, it's really about applying it along the entire continuous process of getting code into production. So I want to cover just kind of 3 simple things. I'll kind of add on to what Mitch has covered in some of the pitfalls, but here's just a few things that are actionable that can help you apply security to existing DevOps principles or practices so that we're not considering security kind of an afterthought or a separate conversation. The first of which is about fostering the culture. And this may seem a little less tactical, but anytime that you think about best practices for DevOps in general, there's always this notion of you've got to have the right culture in place. So shifting to DevOps in general is essentially a big culture shift in and of itself. It likely comes with things like shifting to Agile, or maybe you're shifting some technology stacks to the cloud. And kind of along with this shift, we need to make sure that the organization as a whole is on board with some of the rearranging of teams, or buying the right tools, and allocating the right budget, or including the right people in some of the decision processes. And so really this is not something that one team can kind of be siloed off as a DevOps team and go implement for an organization at large. We really need to make sure that we have the right culture in place. And this applies just as well to adding security to the culture of an organization or your DevOps processes. Same thing is when you've got a DevOps team, you want to make sure that you're including the right folks from the security team, or maybe that you are educating your developers to the point that they understand the security best practices as they develop applications. We're needing to shift all of the security considerations from afterthought and shift them left in the process as close to the original development of the application as we can. Recently, there was an article that published some kind of DevOps anti-patterns as people rally around ways to transition an organization into this more DevOps team structure or workflows. And there's some pitfalls here as well, things like having a dev team, an ops team, and then maybe a smaller group in the middle facilitating conversation. There's a lot of examples of these anti-patterns where people are making best efforts to transition, but there's still some ways in which it can be done suboptimally, if not wrong. And security really is no different as it applies. You want to make sure that there are the teams being incorporated in the same way, that you're pulling the other areas of the business together to formulate your DevOps processes, and including security as part of those same discussions and same teams. So the next best practice is about minding the defaults. Anybody who either lives or has traveled to the UK, this is a nod to the mind the gap that you get on the tube there. But what we're talking about is the defaults that are included in some of these tools that we get. So one of the kind of core principles of DevOps in general is configuration as code, and this establishes a lot of our consistency, and a lot of our ease of deployment. But ultimately, these tools are built to be simple to use and easy to get started with. And so some of the pitfalls that we need to be careful about is some of the default configurations that come with these tools. And so it's one thing to apply that configuration as code and to check it into source control, but to make sure that we're reviewing it and adding the right controls, adding the right default configurations early in the process so that those same things make it all the way into production. An example here is, as many of you may already know, there's last year there was a kind of this slew of MongoDB breaches. And really it all revolved around just nobody changing the default password. And this wasn't just at one organization, it was at lots of organizations. And so the thing to consider here is that, you know, the headlines we see are interesting, right? Like what data got breached, how many people got breached, did the recipe for KFC get breached, and now we're all going to get free KFC recipes. These are the kind of things that are interesting. I got my 10% coupon off at Zappos as a result of the settlement from their breach. Hashtag new shoes. But all these things are interesting in headlines. But what do we care about as developers or as security professionals? We care about root cause analysis. We care about how did this happen? How did they get access to this data? How closely does our architecture look to what their architecture was? And do we have some of the same gaps in security that they do? And so one simple example, I'm going to do my best to do a quick example here. You know, as a DevOps team, maybe we are interested in spinning up a database, and we're probably using some new cool tool like Docker and a free database like Postgres. And so very simply, I need a database. I'm going to stand up a database in a Docker container. And there we go. That was all it took. Database system is ready to accept connections. But if we scroll up a little bit in the output, warning, no password has been set for this database. Anybody with access can see the data. So this is, of course, a very simple example and likely not something that would make it all the way into production, but we've all heard that practice makes perfect. Well, I've also heard it said that practice makes permanent. And so we've got to be careful about the things that we're doing to get things going, to get things started, and how easy it is for that to kind of slip into the test environment and then therefore slip into the production environment. The last kind of tenet here, or best practice here, is something Mitch has already mentioned as well. It's about treating applications as identities. And so as we have all these new automated tools and integrations between different things, between these different tools and different environments, and pushing things out to production and connecting to the Git repository, all of these connection points are, of course, requiring secrets, as we've mentioned before, or requiring some sort of credential to log on. And it's tempting to just kind of create this broad API account and put it in all the different places that need access. But it's important as we kind of apply security to some of those new automation tools and new workflows, that we're treating these applications that, as Mitch already mentioned, have access to very important pieces of information. It may not be data. It could be source code. It could just be access to a server. It could eventually end up being data that gets exfiltrated. And these these applications, we need to monitor in the same way that we traditionally have for PAM, or the privileged access management, in the past for users. These things are accessing critical information and critical infrastructure in different ways, but in a lot of ways in the same kind of manner. So we need to make sure that we're identifying what these applications are. We're granting explicit access, so not just giving them an API account that has access to whatever the API account needs, but also that we're granting them the specific data that they need, the specific secrets or specific credentials, and not just everything. And then also that we're auditing. We've got this audit trail around access, and not just that we're storing it for retrieval, but that we're paying attention to how this is getting used and in what environments and from which locations. So as DevOps teams and kind of the proliferation of DevOps is growing, we as a business beyond trust are, of course, growing right along with it. And so while we certainly have the fundamentals of privileged access management and understanding of the compliance regulations and the audit trails, and even in a lot of ways interacting with these critical infrastructures, one of the things that we've been working on also is a tool that will facilitate secrets management in a DevOps environment. So having a product that is specifically designed for this problem set and not just solving for DevOps, security problems, but also along with it, a new technology stack with using microservices and containers that is consistent with how applications are being built today in a DevOps environment or with DevOps teams, being deployed in the manner that is consistent with how these teams are actually building applications. So we are excited and walking towards releasing that product this month. And just a quick recap on these best practices. It's very, very important to make sure we're looking at the entire pipeline or workflows or CI/CD tool chain and applying security best practices as far left as we can, as close to the initial development of an application, and also making sure we incorporate it along the path of the entire CI/CD process and not just something that's done at the end or as an afterthought. And a few ways to do that are to make sure we have the right culture in place, to use these tools, these automated tools to their best extent, but also be careful about how easy they are to get started with in mining the defaults, and as well as making sure we have a good handle on how many of these applications are in the environment and what access to different systems do they even need, and making sure we're aware of what's connected to what. So with that, I think that's all I had from a presentation perspective. I think we've also got our first poll that we can put up, as well as kind of lead into the Q&A section.
You bet. Here we go. Just launching that first poll. Some feedback that the Beyond Trust folks would like to hear from our audience. While we're doing that, Jason, by the way, I feel compassion for you with your voice between the two of us. Yours is a little worse than mine, but I can tell Winter's certainly on set here. First question that we have is, do you see DevOps teams as falling outside of or not conforming to the traditional PAM initiatives from security groups, being privileged access management?
Right. So something we have definitely seen is not so much that they fall outside of the quote unquote traditional PAM approach to a security team for a security team, but that they're kind of that last leg. They go through all stages of what is our approach to PAM and which things are we going to implement first. And development teams and developers are always kind of that last one. They're the ones that still need direct access to things or full admin control over their environment. And so it's not that they don't conform to it, but they certainly are a challenge. And that's kind of why we see the benefit of splitting that out kind of into its own solution set. And that way you have not just the right practices to apply to them, but the right tools that are consistent with what the specific needs of those teams are.
Great. Let me, looks like we've got about a good number of folks here that have responded to the poll. I'm going to go ahead and share that. I think it would be interesting for all of our participants just to kind of hear where our audience is at on this journey around privileged access management, managing, monitoring privileged accounts, providing secure remote access for third parties, managing least privilege on all endpoints, bridging Unix and Linux into Active Directory, changing audit changes in Active Directory. So clearly the trend, the strongest here in this for this audience is managing and monitoring privileges. Is that something you consistently hear, Jason, from your customers and from prospects? Is that typically at the top of the list or near the top of the list?
So I'm going to have to apologize. I was trying to read through some of the questions. Can you end with the tail end question of that again?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No, it's just asking. Number one was managing, monitoring privileged accounts. Is that typical? Do you typically see that from customers and prospects as one of their top needs that they're looking for help with?
Yeah, absolutely. And that can kind of manifest in a couple of different ways, which is why we have separate pillars for these different problems. In some ways, it's about, me as a person and what I need to do with my environment and my system. But a lot, it's kind of a separate and adjacent problem is about, the infrastructure in my environment and needing to grant access to people to connect to it remotely or monitor what's going on either because of compliance regulations when they're connecting to that critical infrastructure. I mean, you can imagine HIPAA compliance, PCI, all these things that are not necessarily about me, the person, but about the environment and the data that I'm controlling and needing to monitor access around.
Mm-hmm. Great, very good. This next one is maybe something both of us can contribute to. What are some of the important capabilities of a PAM product or a cloud service? You want to take a stab at that first, and then I might add just a few more of my thoughts to that too.
Yeah, absolutely. So the major benefit is kind of twofold. One is just about security best practices, and it's an easy thing to I don't know, have oversight, to not implement, because it can be seen as an inhibitor to productivity or an inhibitor to agility and speed and all these things that are kind of the original goals of transitioning to DevOps. And that's kind of one of the challenges that we face as a vendor, or we face as a DevOps community, is about applying security and PAM tools in a manner in which still allows us to get our job done. And I think that's going to be one of the key things as we move forward into kind of new DevOps workflows and best practices.
Mm-hmm. Very good. What I would add to that is, everyone is at a different place in their journey on security, right? You may already have a PAM type solution that you're looking
Right.
for something new because you're now adding Docker and Kubernetes, or you're going to a cloud, or something that's driving you to look for either a replacement or something good. One thing to consider is, you certainly want something that you can grow with as well as implement and kind of solve the problems today. And if you're on your DevOps journey where key rotation is super important, or because of the application, that might be, some of the things to consider, but may not be important yet. Maybe more important about how do you integrate it into your process, as well as does it have the checkbox of features. One of the things I've learned about looking at products is not just what's the feature list and does it have all the grand things that we'd like to have, but where are we in our maturity as an organization, as a team? How well is this really going to make an impact now and help us solve some of the immediate problems we have and set us up for success, as you kind of heard theme from my talk too, to move down the road. So if automation is really important, then that's, if you're working on that now, that may be important now, but it may be something to kind of hold out. And it's good to hear, kind of frankly, from folks like yourself at Beyond Trust, that you're continuing to innovate your product to address and support the DevOps market. Certainly would be something I would look forward to. Let's see, another question from our audience. What specific information do you have on performance and scalability? Sorry. For example, a major digital rights company uses a competing product to tune the trillions of transactions per year. I'm not sure what they're referring to there, but how do you think about scalability and performance from your perspective, Jason?
Yeah, so I don't know if they're asking about just in general or about the specific products that we're working on, but I'll try to answer in kind of in both contexts. Scale is certainly one of those terms that can mean different things. It could mean a lot of something. It could mean widely distributed thing across the globe. There's more people, more things connected to it, high load and over short periods. There's a lot of different ways to think about scale. And as we look at building solutions for the broader market, we certainly are interested in all of those different aspects of scale. And so that's part of the fundamentals of anything that we build, or especially the new products as they're focused on DevOps environments, is it's not just about the scaling up, right? But especially in like cloud environments where things are scaling up and down, or in high flux. So scale in kind of like a high change environment as well. And so these are all things that we are kind of like building the solution for from the ground up, with microservices that aren't just running in a container, but that are redundant in and of themselves, and leveraging all of the infrastructure that's brought along with that, with nodes that are redundant in and of themselves. And so with not really having any specifics for data points or numbers, but certainly these are all things that we are thinking about and considering as we build solutions.
Okay, wonderful. Let's jump to another question. Someone's asking about ISO 9001. It was a big deal for a while, industries like manufacturing, et cetera, but you don't hear as much about auditing, or at least ISO 9001, and traditional or national standards about cybersecurity, let alone DevOps. I might take a stab of this. I think auditing and standards, ISO, whether it's that or, Sarbanes-Oxley or whatever it might be, those are an important part of, the environment that we work in. They're there for a reason. But I think one of the reasons where you might not have heard about it as much is we're making this shift to a more collaborative and a more automated way of performing those functions. We still hire outside auditors to come in and do a web trust audit. I just went through one about a year and a half ago. And a lot of what those things are, do you have the proper processes in place to meet certain set of standards, and do you follow them? And one of the easiest ways to meet those is having the documentation already in hand to show that, demonstrate it. And that's where a DevOps kind of process, an automated kind of process, where you're creating logs, where you're creating information, you can get reports from that information rather than relying on a manual process. If you build in knowing that you're going to need to pass some audits, the organization will, you will as a DevOps team, it's a great way to be able to leverage your tools. And yet another way where rather than security becomes this great big thing, we have to go through a huge process and pull a bunch of information together. A lot of that can be automated, and the security team, the auditing team, could be monitoring on that on an ongoing basis. So when it comes time to audit, here it is, it's already there. So I would encourage folks to kind of think about auditing that as a just validating the process that we've got in place that creates that information rather than having to go get it, secure it, and report on it. Think about it that way. Any thoughts, Jason, you might have about that you want to add?
Yeah, I'll add a couple of the, first of all, it is actually something that we see quite a bit. It's not necessarily the topic of this webinar, but that third pillar that I mentioned about needing to get access to these environments, these, segmented SCADA networks, all that apply to those. Sometimes they're air-gapped networks, things that were traditionally built without security in mind because they were isolated, and that in connectivity was the primary concern and not security, because within the environment it was siloed and nobody had access to it who didn't need access to it. Well, as that has kind of changed, I don't know that I've ever kind of drawn that correlation to the DevOps, but as that kind of those environments have changed, and some of those old legacy systems are being brought online so that vendors can have connectivity to their control modules and all of these things. That's definitely something that we see and we work with customers on for how do you kind of apply security to this environment that really wasn't a consideration in the front end. But then just to kind of tie that back to the topic at hand, this is one of those opportunities that we have to kind of learn from the sins of the past as a development community, and that's to make sure we understand that we need to have these considerations on the forefront, even if in that moment they're not as necessary as they seem. There's so many implications down the line. Who knows how many years down the road, that as long as we're building the right processes in place in the beginning, that's going to have lasting effects.
Mm-hmm. I definitely agree with that. I'm going to pop up a poll. It's just to gauge some interest if anyone is interested in talking with one of the folks from Beyond Trust. So I'm going to do that while we address our next question. And I'm going to kind of toss this out to you, Jason. Next question is it important to stick with one vendor or technology stack for all of our automated DevOps tools?
Yeah, this is one of those situations where I get to, I'm in product management, not in sales, so I'm going to give you my opinion here. And even as a vendor who offers multiple tools, there's certainly value in kind of staying within the family, if you will. But to be honest, it's just a matter of buying the right tool for the right job. And so if that means that you're crossing vendors, as long as the integrations are in place, and more primarily, as long as the tool that you're looking at solves the problem at hand, that's, at least in my opinion, kind of the foremost consideration there. So it's not always important to stay within one vendor. There's certainly value to that, and even just ancillary benefits to sticking with one vendor and one throat to choke, so to speak. But when we're talking about security and building the right tool chains and pipelines, oftentimes that's built from different tools that are integrated and working together.
Well, especially with security products, it tends to be the thing you choose it has a little bit of stickiness, right? It's not easy to go and swap that out.
Yeah,
So I
true.
agree with what you're saying. Even though DevOps teams like to switch out tools, and you can do that sometimes when things are more automated, sometimes things like credential management tools, et cetera. So you do want to be thoughtful, kind of what you're choosing up front. Well, great. It looks like we've gotten through our questions from our audience, Jason. So thank you very much for your presentation. I thought you did a great job. Your voice hung in there, most
Yeah,
important.
thanks. We made it.
And also thanks to everyone from our audience for your great questions. Also want to remind, just once again, we did our recording, did record the webinar, and as well, the slides will be available via an email that we'll send to everyone. Of course, you can pick those up on DevOps.com website. And be sure and check out the site because we have other exciting upcoming webinars. So last but not least, let's get to our 3 Amazon gift cards. We have 3 winners. We're going to announce. First is Clark S. Second is Jin M. And the third is Benoit R. I may have that as a first or last name. Not sure if I got that right, but we will reach out and connect with the 3 of you to get you those Amazon gift cards. So congratulations to our winners. I'd like to thank Jason Jones, our Senior Product Manager from Beyond Trust, speaker today. It's been my great privilege and honor to also be one of the presenters on today's webinar. Of course, we want to thank Beyond Trust for our sponsorship. Oh, most important, I want to thank our audience. We've spent near an hour together, and we know your time is extremely valuable. And the fact that you spent it with us is something we hold dear, and we want to make sure we do a great job delivering value, and hope that we have. It's been my pleasure hosting today, and we wish everyone to have a great rest of your day, and be careful out there.
Thanks, everybody.